Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for attending this, our latest in our webinar series. I will give you a little bit of information near the end of the webinar on how to see all of our webinars off of our website, past and future. Thank you very much for attending today. A couple of detail items before we get started. I'm going to introduce Michael Cooper to you, who's the expert in the room. My name is Tim Noka. For questions during the webinar, we're going to pause at 15 minutes after the hour to answer any questions that have come in the meantime. And in order to do that, to give us questions, please type them into the question area. Additionally, we will wrap the webinar up at 30 minutes after the hour. Michael and I will stay until every last question is answered after that time. So any questions that you have at any point in the webinar, go ahead and put them in there. We will make sure to serve them before we're done for the day. Michael Cooper is an Adobe certified expert and instructor, almost 20 years of teaching and design in web and mobile development, obviously with an eye towards accessibility and user experience as an important baseline within that development. That's how he's developed his expertise that he's going to bring us today. Michael began his career as a graphic designer way back in the mid-90s. Then he branched into 2D and 3D animation of programming and then into marketing, advertising, and communications. Michael's previous positions include art director at a promotions firm in Toronto and director of training at a continuing ed firm. He's represented Adobe Systems and Corel Corporation at worldwide and prestigious events, most often speaking in the areas of today's subject matter, accessibility and user experience. Michael uses his knowledge of functional accessibility and compliance with that background in instructional design and adult learning models to help create engaging, accessible content in course design and, of course, in content delivery as well. So with that as an introduction, I give you the mic, Michael, and again, appreciate your participation, sir, and everybody that is attending. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Tim. That was a stellar intro. Today we're going to talk about laws and regulations, web content accessibility guidelines. We hear a lot of terminology around the different aspects of accessibility. And what we always want to keep in mind is the purpose of accessibility is for everybody to have equal access to all the products, all the services that anybody else has the same access to. Sometimes we think about access when really what we're talking about is accommodation. So if you had a movie theater and you had one person who was blind, one person who was deaf, one person who had a mobility challenge, say they're in a wheelchair, and one person with no diagnosed disabilities. And the four of them are friends and they wanted to go see a movie. If they had to go to different movie theaters, or if they even had to go to different theaters inside the theater, because one had closed captioning and one had audio description and one had accessible seating, that's not really accessibility, because now these four friends can't go and watch the same movie at the same time. A lot of times we're looking for, what's the quickest, easiest way we can do this? What's the cheapest way we can do this? And if your motivating factor, if you shift that motivating factor to saying, how can we make sure that everybody has the same access, the same avenues to all of the things that they have the rights to have access to, it just kind of changes your way of thinking about things. Outside of this, this motivation being that it's the right thing to do, there is a legal aspect. In this brief half hour, we're going to talk specifically about the legal aspect, because for a lot of companies, including government, NGOs, private sector, a lot of them, the legal aspect is the first scariest thing that sometimes comes up. So we're literally going to teach you how to not get sued over your web content. You can see our agenda here. Why should we care about this? What does the law actually say in terms of accessible content online? And we're going to come into this thing called WCAG, or WCAG, or the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. I've heard it called WCAG, WCAG. What is that? What exactly is that, and how does it fit into our laws and regulations? How do we comply with the existing laws and legislation, and how do we protect ourselves moving forward knowing full well that legislation can change at times. And then we're going to talk a little bit about from here, like beyond the regulations. Once you know that you are legally compliant, is there more that you could do? We're going to talk about what you need to do, but we're only really going to touch on the how you do it because it's very specific to your technology. If you are a web officer, the techniques that you would use are very different than if you're in document production, working with Office Docs or working with desktop publishing programs like Adobe InDesign and so on, if you're in e-learning. So the how-to is very specific to your technology, but the what you're doing and the why you're doing is always going to be the same. So we'll touch a little bit on the how-to, and as Tim said, we're going to leave some time for Q&A. And if you have questions, make sure you ask them as we go along. We'll answer some of them as we're going along, and we're more than happy to stay after the session to make sure all your questions get answered. I'm going to jump straight in. Why should we care? When we know why we're doing this, it makes your workflow more efficient. I can tell a web designer, you need to put an alt attribute on every image element that has a qualified string that describes the content in that image. That's a pretty straight direction. So the web officer says, okay, I'll do that. And then they look at a picture that they're supposed to put this alt text on, and they're charged with describing that picture. If you know why you're doing that, if you know who you're targeting with that description, it makes it much easier for you to do it because you understand the purpose of why you're doing this. When we talk about accessibility barriers, most of the time, it has nothing to do with the person's disability or their assistive technology. It has to do with the fact that the system has not been designed in a way to be accessible to all users. So our job is to remove these barriers, because if we don't, it can be classified as discrimination. So there are 6 big reasons why we need to care about accessibility. And the first one is leaving out part of your audience is just bad business. It's poor strategy. If you look at a movie theater and you say, why do movie theaters have ramps and elevators and accessible seating? Inevitably, somebody comes up with the argument that, well, if they have those accessible facilities, then people who require those will go there and they'll sell more tickets. They'll sell more movie tickets because they'll get a bigger audience. While that's true, in the case of movie theaters, they almost always lose money installing, maintaining these facilities than they do off of ticket sales. But when you think about web content, when you think about online sales, products and services, 30 to 40% of your audience may have some form of disability. And if you don't give them the quickest, easiest access to get to your products and services, it's just bad business. Another reason is for your search engine optimization. When you start coding your web content to be accessible, it's not just accessible to people. It becomes accessible to the technology. And when it becomes accessible to technology, you're opening up it to be accessible also to things like web crawlers and content aggregators. So if Google knows the purpose of your site and somebody's searching for things that you have, it's a lot easier for Google to make that connection. And when you program your content to be accessible, you're going to get better search engine results. If you do not have accessible content, you're never going to be able to recruit and retain some of the best people that you might benefit, that your organization might benefit from having employed. If somebody is blind, they currently, as of today, they're not allowed to be an airplane pilot. That's not discrimination. That is a safety issue. If you're blind, you're not allowed to fly a plane. Whenever I bring this up, inevitably some student says, yet, just wait, don't worry. We've all seen Star Trek with Geordi, the blind navigator of the Enterprise. However, if you have an application for flight school, is there any reason why that application should be accessible? If I'm not allowed to apply to flight school if I'm blind, why would the application need to be accessible? Well, who's processing that application? You might hire an admin assistant to be processing these applications, doing some sort of screening, predetermined screening. And there's no reason why that person can't be blind. In fact, what we find is that users with disabilities, in terms of general usage of technology, are oftentimes much more experienced than users without disabilities. In other words, people with disabilities generally know more how to use their computer, how to search for stuff online. The reason being is because this technology, because they've had to learn it in order to access certain things, they spend more time with it than the average person. And so you have all these people that are highly skilled and highly qualified. And if you don't provide them an avenue to find you and to apply to your organization, you're going to miss these people. It's the right thing to do. Morally, ethically, it is the right thing to do. It's discrimination. It's a human rights violation to not provide access, the same access for everybody. And what we're going to talk about today is, quite simply, it's the law. So if you do not provide accessible content, you are opening yourself up for litigation. Now, depending on what country, what state, what city you're in, the degree of litigation and the type of litigation might vary. In some countries, it's easier to sue a company for money. In some countries, it's harder to sue a company for money, but you can definitely get them shut down. You can have the government enforce these laws, enforce the company to either take the content down or to make it accessible within a certain time frame. But the bottom line is, legally, you have to make your content accessible. This is a short list of large companies, educational organizations, government organizations that are all in litigation, either currently or have been settled in 2019. You can see there's some big names on this list. This is going to happen. The last reason we want to talk about making your content accessible is that this could be an opportunity. When you have older systems, sometimes it's very difficult to find the ammunition to get the funding and the time to improve these systems, to update them. This is the perfect opportunity, because if you go to your CFO, if you go to your manager, whoever's in charge of the purse strings, and you say, look, we have to change this system because right now the system is not creating accessible content, and legally we have to create accessible content, that all of a sudden opens up a whole new world where you can say we need to upgrade these systems, we need to re-examine our workflow, you can make it more efficient, you can have access to training for upskilling, for reskilling. So it is really a huge opportunity. And this is what we try to tell people, is that you have to do it anyway. So what you want to do is you want to embrace it. You want to look at this as an opportunity, not an obligation. So there's a number of reasons why accessibility is very important. For people with disabilities, it's even more critical than that. This is just a quick example. My son, one of my sons, is colorblind, meaning he can't see the difference between red, yellow, and green. It all looks like different shades of yellow to him. And so if we look at these traffic lights, because they're horizontal, one is on the right, one is on the left, these would both look like different shades of yellow to him. In other words, if you can't distinguish between these colors, how are you supposed to tell which one is green and which one is red? If it's a new city, because these are municipal laws, right? Or provincial or state laws. If you've never been here before, you won't know. So not knowing which one is which, especially if you're far away. It's one thing if you're close up and you can see that one is on the left and one is on the right. But you can imagine if you're far away, you probably can't tell the difference between any of these lights. In the province of Quebec, in Canada, they have a multi-light shape and color system. So you can see that the red lights are square, and there's two of them, and they're on the outside. So even if you were colorblind from far away, it would be a lot easier to tell that there's two lights rather than one light, and then you know that that light is in the stop position. So for people with disabilities, if this has never touched your life, it doesn't mean, if you've never thought about this, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It's just sometimes when things don't touch our lives, it's not on our radar, right? And so for people that actually have disabilities, this is part of their everyday life. And our job is to remove the barriers so that they can be independent. The major sort of categories of disabilities that we talk about are visual, hearing, mobility, and cognitive. When we think about visual deficiency or visual disabilities, of course, we always think of people who are blind, but there are people who have low vision. We need to say zoom in on the screen. There are people who have color deficit, what we often refer to as color blindness. So they have perfect vision, but they cannot distinguish between certain colors. Cataracts. There's different types and different degrees of visual impairment. Not every person with a visual impairment uses a screen reading device. Some of them will zoom in on the screen. Some of them will switch to a high contrast display. People who have auditory impairment or hearing difficulties. Again, we oftentimes think of people who are deaf, but they may have low hearing. They may have tinnitus. So there's different types and degrees, of course, of hearing difficulties. Dexterity or mobility challenges. If your website or your web content relies on the user being able to grip, click, and drag a mouse, it's not going to be accessible to certain people with certain types of disabilities. Meaning we have to make sure that every action can be completed through a keyboard only. Cognitive and learning disabilities are sometimes the most challenging in terms of your web content because there's few technical solutions. With cognitive and learning difficulties, it more is in the authoring of the content, making sure we're using clear language, making sure that abbreviations and acronyms are clearly labeled in some way. So with cognitive and learning difficulties, there are web content accessibility guidelines that specifically address this type of disability, but oftentimes we don't have a technical solution. And this is why everybody has a role in making sure your online content is accessible. All the way from the content authors, the editors, the designers, the developers, even the project managers, even people in procurement, people in legal. When you're writing a contract for a contractor, you have to make sure that the contractor claims that they can actually create accessible content, and they need examples of how they've done that in the past, and that needs to be built into the contract, that if the content they deliver is not accessible, then they're not fulfilling their part of the contract. So it's not that somebody in legal needs to know how to create an accessible website, but they need to know enough to know which clauses they need to include in their contract to protect themselves.
The first question we have is, what are the penalties for not being compliant? And they use the acronym WCAG that you called a couple of different things. What are the penalties for not being compliant?
That's a great question. So, and it's one of the first ones we always get. It's kind of funny because if you think about any other law, like you're not allowed to beat somebody up on the street, most people don't think about, okay, but what if I do? I'm sure there are some, but most people, it's not a thought in their brain about, okay, but what's really gonna happen if I do this? And it's not that it doesn't mean you're a bad person, but of course, private organizations have to consider the financial aspect. Government organizations, of course, there's a financial aspect, but also it's time. It really varies. It varies on the level of barrier, person that is being discriminated against, the city or the state, or in some countries we call them provinces, or the country that you're in. In the United States, there have been multiple settlements now, and the most recent was Target, and it essentially cost them $10 million. So it's severe. Part of that money went to restitution, went to the actual plaintiffs in the class action lawsuit. Part of that money had to go to making sure that their website is accessible, not only to the development of it, but also to the monitoring and the reporting of it. So it's not necessarily that the $10 million just came right out of the bank and went to a bunch of people. About 60% of it did, but it was the cost associated with ensuring that they are now going to be compliant with the law. In Canada, it's more difficult to sue a company on a personal level for financial reasons. Generally, what happens in Canada is the company or the government organization will be issued a strict timeline. You must be accessible within this time frame. If somebody's human rights have been violated, they haven't been able to apply for a job, they may have to be awarded an interview, a proper accommodation interview for that job. But there are also fines, and the fines can be up to $5,000 per day after the deadline that they've been given in order to become compliant. So it does vary depending on the geography and depending on, again, the nature of the complaint, but it can be very severe. So let's talk about how to avoid all that, right? If we are compliant. One of the best things it gives us is it gives us security. Okay? There's an alphabet soup of acronyms that float around. Section 508, ICT, WCAG, why ARIA. I'm going to do my best to put this all together to you in a way that makes perfect sense. My goal is by the end of this webinar that you are able to actually explain this to anybody else about how all these things fit together. The laws and regulations that mandate that we are WCAG compliant. Don't worry, I'm going to explain what WCAG is. I'm going to explain the difference between compliance and conformance. We'll get there. But how did these laws actually come about? Why is this a legal necessity? And it all stems from human rights. Human rights are not new. We've had human rights in every country for years, some countries, tens, hundreds of years. The Constitution is essentially human rights, a human rights document. So these laws aren't new. Human rights laws apply to government, they apply to non-government organizations, they apply to private sector organizations. Human rights laws have been upheld in legal cases all around the world. The difficulty with new technologies is you have to prove at some point in time that this new technology fits under this human rights. So the example I always give is if you have a person who's in a wheelchair and they cannot enter a building because there's stairs going up, because there's no ramp, there's no elevator, for whatever reason they cannot get into this building, there's no automatic door opener, and it's preventing them from accessing some needed service or even just something they want to do, like go to the mall. That is a clear violation of their human rights. It's discrimination. But how does that compare to somebody who's blind, who goes to a website and is not able to access a service or apply for a job or even buy a product from a private organization, where somebody who's not blind could do this? This is exactly what's happening with Domino's Pizza right now in the States. The Supreme Court has ruled that Domino's must defend themselves in court against the plaintiff who is suing them because all of their services that are available online and through their app are not accessible to this person who happens to be blind. Even though there are alternate ways that this guy can order a pizza. He can phone them, he could go to a location, there are alternate ways. However, their app, which is hugely popular, is able to allow you to order exactly what you want, track the delivery, know when it's going to show up, and it's not accessible to somebody who's blind. And so he launched a lawsuit. And Domino's took it all the way to the Supreme Court to say we don't have to, we don't fall under these laws and regulations. This is not under Title II of the ADA. And the Supreme Court said, yeah, it does. They didn't make a ruling in favor of the plaintiff. They did not. There's no judgment that has come down in the actual lawsuit. But what has happened at the Supreme Court level is they have said unequivocally, a private organization now has to answer in court. The case will still have to be decided. But it's a huge win for accessibility laws and regulations that this decision has come down, because it means that we don't need a law that very specifically says, hey, Domino's needs to make their application accessible to blind people. We're saying human rights extends to web content and to applications. Essentially what's happening right now is this case has gone to court, and if a judge rules that, yes, this is definitely a violation of human rights, we now have some precedent. But every case that comes up is going to have these nuanced details. And so what we do is we create more specific laws. So what happened in the US was they amended some existing laws to incorporate web technologies. And what they did was they kind of combined what you had to do with how you had to do it. So with Section 508, they specifically named web technologies. And I'm sort of breezing through these slides, but a recording of this will be available to you later, and you can sort of come back and read these slides in more detail if you like. But just to give you a quick example, there is reference in the guidelines about things like client-side image maps. Client-side image maps are a very specific implementation of HTML. So how does this affect a PDF document or a Word document? Or what if the technology changes? The big advantage to including the how-to in the what and the why is that it's all in one place. But as we see, almost everything that was covered in Section 508 has an equivalent WCAG standard that if you just complied with WCAG, you'd be meeting 508 anyway. The rest of the world did. The countries that have actually implemented these laws, I'm not saying every country in the world has done, but many countries have, is what they did is instead of creating their own set of specifications for what makes an accessible website, is they said, we are going to use a standard that already exists. And that's what WCAG is. They said, look, this is an international, nonpartisan organization that has no vested interest in the outcome. And they've created this standard that if you do these things, your web content will be accessible. And so what they did was they made the law point to this legislation. Now, we're kind of getting close to the end time. I just want to take a few minutes to show you how all this stuff ends up fitting together. The US caught up, and in fact, they went one better. In the Section 508 refresh, the American law now also points to WCAG. And what that means is essentially worldwide, every country that is implementing web content accessibility laws are all pointing to the same standard. They're pointing to WCAG. And so this is just some of the provinces, states, and countries that have implemented legislation. And you can see they're all pointing to WCAG 2.0, what we call AA standard. What this means is the laws almost don't matter anymore. I don't want to say they don't matter because that's how they're going to be enforced. But really, what it's saying is no matter where you are, no matter where your company is based, whether you're government, non-government, private sector, you have to be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. So don't the federal laws only apply to federal government websites? Well, this is where it gets a little bit sticky because the way the legislation is introduced, ratified, how some governments can sometimes put things on hold or back up on things. What you need to remember is that most states are also implementing statewide accessibility laws. Also, we always come back to this thing where it's covered under human rights. So the very specific laws that are governing your state, maybe they will give you a timeline. Oh, by 2021, you have to be WCAG 2.0 AA compliant. Maybe they'll have some very minor exceptions. If you have a live video broadcast, you don't have to provide audio description for it. There'll be some very minor exemptions or some timelines, but that's really the only place the legislation is going to be different. What does this mean in terms of WCAG? It means regardless of your country, your human rights and your accessibility regulations will always mandate you be WCAG 2.0 compliant. And I'm just going to jump ahead to how all of this kind of fits together. WCAG is a standard. It's an ISO standard, and it's technology independent. It means you can apply it to a PDF, a Word document, a web page. It's a set of testable criteria. It's a checklist. You either pass, fail, or not applicable. It's basically telling you the what you have to do. There are 3 levels of WCAG. If you meet level A, this means that some people will still find it impossible to access your content. If you meet level AA, the majority of people with different types of disabilities will be able to access the content. This is why level AA is the standard. This is the standard that every country is implementing these laws, every state, every municipality. They're all choosing to target level AA because it's fairly easy to meet, and it provides the most access to the most amount of people. Level AAA kind of goes above and beyond. So if you think about a video that has captions, a user who is deaf could read captions on the screen. But if the captions are too fast, or if the user has difficulty reading, then you would have to put sign language, a little inset with a sign language. And that's a huge difference. Putting captions on a video compared to videotaping something, doing a transcript, translating to sign language, videotaping the person, superimposing it. This is why it's a AAA requirement. It's sort of like above and beyond. WCAG is sort of organized into these 4 overreaching areas, but really it's a straight checklist. I want to give you one specific example, and we'll open it up for Q&A, and I'll show you how all this stuff kind of fits together. One specific WCAG criteria is 242 page title. It says web pages have titles that describe the topic or purpose. So this tells us what we have to do. If we actually go and look at that criterion, I'm just on the WCAG website right now, and if we actually go and look at 2.4.2 page title, it says web pages have titles that describe the topic or purpose. If that's not clear to you, there's a whole set of documentation called understanding. And the understanding document is the why. This is the what we have to do. The understanding documentation tells us why we have to do it. It will tell you the intention. It will tell you some examples. We'll say, look, the reason a title is important is so that a user knows that they're on the right page. But it still doesn't tell you how to do it. So the how to meet documentation actually tells you how to do it. If you are using HTML, here's what you need to put in your HTML code. If you are using a PDF document, here's how you put the title in a PDF document. And so the how-to is specific to your technology. The criterion tells us what to do. The understanding tells us why we're doing it. The how to meet tells us exactly that. It's how we are going to go about doing this. For a web page, we would use a technique called H25. We'd use a title element in the document. For a PDF, we would go to the file properties and put it in there. For PowerPoint, there's no specific technique listed in WCAG. Does that mean a PowerPoint can't be accessible? No. I know how to do this. In fact, I can show you how we do this. If I go to my PowerPoint's File tab, and I look at the properties under Info, you'll see here I actually have a title attribute right here. Sometimes you need to discover the technique using your technology to meet this criterion. We are going to open it up for Q&A. I'm just going to show you how this all fits together. What happens is the laws and regulations are mandating that you conform to a specific standard, and that's WCAG 2.0. How you do that depends on the technology that you're using, your specification. So you saw how in HTML we would do it one way, in PDF we would do it a different way. I even showed you how you could do it in PowerPoint when there's not even a technique for that in the WCAG guidelines. So if you can show that you've used a sufficient technique to meet each of the items on this checklist, we only looked at one item, right? But if you can show that you met all of these checklists, everything that applies to your content, then what you're doing is you're proving that you have conformed to the standard, which proves that you are compliant with the law. And that's kind of how the whole thing fits together. We have a little bit more content that goes into a bit more detail if anybody wants to stick around, but I think first we'll answer some questions for those of you that are still here.
Could we do me a favor? Do you have that last slide? I just want to make sure that everybody has a chance to see before we dig into Q&A. If you want to take the opportunity to dig in a little bit deeper, we do have some guaranteed to run classes that are upcoming. Guaranteed to run classes in the event that you want to dig a little bit deeper. There's the place to go. Contact your account manager at ProTech. Again, our thanks for coming. Past webinars, future webinars are available on the resource page of our website. We continue to do this webinar series at a pace of about one every 3 weeks or so. Watch for anything upcoming there or any old recordings that you might like to see. Into the Q&A, Michael. Currently have 2, and I think I got a new one that just came in. Since these are laws and regulations, will they not change along with changes in government?
Excellent question. The laws and regulations that are specific to municipalities, states, and so on, even federal law. Of course, it's legislation that's subject to change, but we also know how long it takes for those things to get implemented. We also know that it's going to be really, really bad platform for any party to come up and say, we're going to get rid of our accessibility laws. We're going to say it's okay to discriminate against people. It's highly unlikely that things will get rolled back. Things that started under Bush Sr., to get the accessibility ball rolling that continued all the way through the Obama administration. I'm talking specifically about the US. Kind of got stalled with the Trump administration in that they couldn't introduce new legislation without showing that they were going to take away two different regulations. That's difficult to do with accessibility because it builds rather than detracts. But it doesn't stop the fact that all of this stuff is based on your human rights, which will never be repealed. That's never going to go away. The Constitution will always be there. Same in Canada, we have human rights laws. The Americans with Disability Act, the ADA Title III, it's not going anywhere. And what we're seeing is that at the Supreme Court level, they're saying this applies. And so all that new legislation will do is make it easier for people to understand what does it mean? How do I know when I'm accessible? And really, how you know is if you're 2.0 AA compliant. So yes, it's possible that the laws and regulations may change slightly from organization to organization. But the bottom line is, if you can prove you've done your part, you have excellent ammunition to mitigate any litigation. More importantly, if your website is accessible, nobody's going to target you. There's two ways that you're going to get, well, technically there's three ways. You could have a random audit by a governing organization. It's unlikely because they just have too much on their plate to go policing all this stuff. The second case would be somebody actually tries to use your web content and they can't access it, and they may launch a lawsuit. Or they may make a formal complaint. If your website is accessible, that's not going to happen because they'll be able to use your products and services. The third one is what we call the drive-by. It's a lawyer's office who's just out there looking for lawsuits. It doesn't mean they're wrong. You might not agree with their motivation. However, it's the law. So if they find a website that it is not accessible and they decide to then take it to court, you might not agree with their motivation, but they're not wrong. That website should be accessible. Well, if your website's accessible, they won't attack you. They will go to your website, they'll run some tests, they'll go, hey, this website's accessible, we're not making any money here, let's move on. But most importantly, if your users can access your content, that's really why we're doing it. We don't have laws so that we can launch lawsuits. We don't have laws just to make your life miserable. We have laws to improve people's lives. That's why they're there. So you have to always come back to this. So yeah, it's possible. Some legislation may change from administration to administration. It's never going to go back to the point where you don't have to make your content accessible.
Excellent.
Anybody else?
Thank you. The PowerPoints, I was asked about the PowerPoints. The PowerPoints from this presentation will be made available along with the recording afterwards. So that one is asked and answered. Thank you for that good question. The last question I currently have, Michael, what if we don't have the ability or the authority to change our website to make it accessible?
Right. So this also comes up quite often. This course, this webinar that we're doing right now, it's really a sampler of this one-day course that we have listed up here. In the full one-day course on how not to get sued, we go into this stuff in a lot more detail. You can just see from the content we've covered so far, we've kind of scratched the surface. And so hopefully what you've taken away from this is understanding that, okay, I need to be WCAG compliant and conformant in order to comply with the laws and regulations. And that the way I implement that is going to vary depending on my technology. What we talk about in a lot more detail in the full one-day course, we talk about roles and responsibilities. Where is your content coming from? And who is hosting it? And do you have the actual capability to modify that content? And so I'll tell you briefly. The person held responsible will be the person who owns that content. If it's a private company, if it's a commercial company, and they have a website, then the company themselves as a corporation is responsible. The company cannot say, well, we hired a contractor, we hired a company to make our website and they didn't make it accessible. Because it's your job to make sure that you hired a company that can make it accessible, and it was your job to test and prove that they did actually make it accessible. In terms of government, it will be the department head. So if it's a state level government, it would be whoever's governor of the state at the time. Now, of course, we know that, the people at the top, never end up actually taking the fall for any of this stuff. And I don't want to talk in terms like that, but if you have no control, let's say you're using a content management system that's already in place, and you have no way to modify the content management system, it doesn't matter. You're going to have to update or replace that content management system with one with a different system or an updated system that can create this. Now, that doesn't mean everything is the job of the web officer. When you have an image on your website, it needs to have a text description. But it's almost never the web officer's job to write it, because they wouldn't normally write copy that goes on the web page. So they shouldn't be writing descriptions of images. And so within your organization, you have to determine your roles and responsibilities. And we go into that in a lot more detail in the full one-day course. And we're not trying to withhold any information. We're not trying to pitch you a bunch of stuff. It's just that we only have a certain amount of time to cover this stuff right now. If the content is being brought in from another source, but it's being hosted in your environment, you are ultimately responsible for it. You have to either find a way to make it accessible, or take the content down, or point to the external source and warn people, hey, here's some content on a different website, and we cannot guarantee that that content is accessible.
So I think with that, we're going to say, again, our thanks very much for coming. Thanks very much for staying. It's greatly appreciated. Michael, thank you very much for a good webinar, and everybody have a great day.